Today we'll be discussing the recent controversy concerning comedian Hasan Minhaj, and we'll be discussing narcissistic personality disorder. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic from medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today we'll be discussing the controversy surrounding a recent article about comedian Hasan Minhaj. And we'll also be discussing narcissistic personality disorder.
Those are too close together. You needed a sorbet, Asif. You needed some kind of palate cleanser. Now it clearly looks like we think that Hasan Minhaj has narcissistic personality disorder, which we do not. We cannot say that. If you want to say that after we go through NPD, I know the lingo. If you want to think it, you can, but that's not what we're saying.
No, there's no evidence out there that he has this disorder. So we just coincidentally chose these two. We've been meaning to talk about narcissistic personality disorder for a while now, and we just thought this is a perfect time.
It's more an intervention because I wanted to tell you that you have it and you should just chill out.
Well, we'll see about that. Once we get to that topic, you can decide who amongst your friends and colleagues has narcissistic personality disorder. Even you, too, can diagnose people with a personality disorder
It's a
inappropriately.
game where everyone loses.
Okay, Ali, I want to talk to you about this recent article. It's generated a lot of buzz in the media about Hasan Minhaj. By the way, I try to pronounce his name the way he prefers to pronounce it because Hasan and Ali Hassan are actually very similar. They're the same name, just one has two S's in it, but they're the same name, originally from Arabic. So why do I pronounce them differently? I just do, but I'm just trying to respect Hasan
Different
Minhaj.
people have different preferences. Hasan Minhaj.
Minhaj, because I usually say Hasan Minhaj sounds like he's related to Nicki Minaj, which he is not.
Yeah.
Again, we have no proof that he is or is not related to her. Okay. No proof. So, Ali, maybe you can walk us through this article. It was in the New Yorker by Clare Malone. If you guys have not read this article, you may want to just take it. It probably takes like 15 or 20 minutes to read it. It's not a terribly long article. You may want to just take a quick peek at this article and then come back to the podcast because it's very well written, well researched, and very interesting.
Yeah, the article in the New Yorker is called Emotional Truths. It is about Hasan Minhaj. It is, at its core, is an article about how much non-truth telling, for lack of a better term, right now, we're going to dive into that, can a comedian do? How much are they afforded? How many lies are they afforded? And it's a very interesting thing because when I first heard about the article, not having read it, I was like, this is a non-story. All comedians make stuff up. Every comedian you have gone to see will start a joke with like, so I saw this guy earlier today on the sidewalk. You didn't see a guy. You certainly didn't see him today. He wasn't on the sidewalk. You just thought about this and you created a whole thing, right? So in my mind, I'm like, why is this? And for me, it felt like, what kind of weird hit job is this that's happening right now? To read the article is to realize, as is often the case, the depth of where this goes to and the complexity of this subject, because it is one thing for a comedian to fabricate, to exaggerate, to conflate different stories, to take somebody else's story and make it their own. It is one thing for a comedian to do that. As it turns out, whether we like it or not, whether Hasan Minhaj likes it or not, it is another thing for Hasan Minhaj to do it. And that is what this article is really about. Why do we hold Hasan Minhaj to a different standard? Well, he was the lead and only anchor on his own show, Patriot Act, a show that was rigorously fact-checking, because they were at risk of getting death threats from certain countries, which they did. India was definitely very upset, and so was Saudi Arabia. And Hasan's life was a little bit like, it's probably more than he bargained for. But rigorous fact-checking is critical for that show. He has also been a correspondent and now a guest anchor and up for possibly being the replacement of Trevor Noah as the anchor of The Daily Show, another show that requires tons of fact checking. They have journalists on staff who fact check and probably get in the way and really jam things up, really kill the buzz of the show often. That's a different story altogether. But, there's some stories that Hasan told, two that really stick with me in his specials. And one was about a Muslim, an FBI operative posing as a Muslim in his mosque. He called him Brother Eric. It's a great story. Many people immediately went to the internet and were like, is this true? This can't be true. This is a crazy story. And what do you know? Brother Eric exists and he was in a mosque. And you're like, wow, that's insane. A little bit more prying reveals that Brother Eric existed, but was nowhere near Hasan Minhaj's mosque. He was actually in prison in the year that Hasan Minhaj said that he was there. He didn't even operate in the same area of California. And so it was completely, he took something that existed somewhere and applied it to him. Another story is this envelope that came to his home. He opened it, powder fell out of the envelope. And when I heard this story already, I was like, I don't believe that this is true. I believe his daughter might have been nearby, but the story he told was it went right on his daughter and they had to rush her to the hospital. And so he's pulling on, it's a very emotional story. Obviously, he minds it for laughs after the fact, but he goes to some deeply emotional places. And I went along in those places as well with him, even though part of me didn't believe that it happened, just because I'm a comedian and I know how, stories are created. But the idea in this New Yorker article is, what is somebody like Hasan Minhaj allowed to get away with? What are they allowed to do? He was confronted. This is being referred to as an expose in the New Yorker. This article, Clare Malone, who wrote it, she went and did the research on his jokes and found that a number of them, I think she mentions 5 in total, never happened or didn't happen to him. And when he was pressed about it and questioned about it, he was pretty, casual and not caring about it. He said, it doesn't matter. He's not going for the actual truth. He is going for the emotional truth. The fact is, it happened. It didn't happen to him, but these are things that happen. Or if they're too crazy and would never happen, he said, that's the point, that some of these things are so crazy, but crazy things are happening. So on. So again, it is to be read. It is to be read just so you can get a sort of an honest, assessment of your own on what is happening here. Asif, your reaction when you read this was not a pleasant one as far as Hasan Minhaj is concerned. Is that right?
I think it's pretty damning article. I think his nonchalance about it is the most damning thing. I think he's not going to get the host of The Daily Show because of this. I think that's pretty clear. And I'll get into why maybe in a couple minutes about what I really think the issue is. The article, I think it's well reported, well researched, as we said. I do think it kind of gets into things that are a bit tangential about how some of the people he worked with thought that he was maybe didn't treat some of the people that well, were dismissive. Now, the author's point is a lot of these people were the fact checkers and journalists on Patriot Act, and he kind of dismissed them. It's a bit hard to tell if it was just overall kind of rude behavior or specifically rude to them because they were trying to instill the facts into his thing. And remember, Patriot Act, just like The Daily Show, and just like last week tonight with John Oliver, it's like a PowerPoint presentation, right? They'll talk, and then at the back, they have the facts. They have, and they'll reference Reuters, and they'll reference the New York Times, or they'll play clips from CNN. So they're always referencing and backing up everything they say. So I think this is what you have to couch everything in. I do want to ask you, Ali, again, before I get really into my opinions about this, is this similar to other examples where we've had people telling mistruths, misremembering things? And maybe we'll give one example from comedy or comedian that you've told me about, and then I'll give one example from like a news anchor, because this is someone who's in between, right? And Hasan Minhaj and Jon Stewart don't consider themselves that. They consider themselves just comedians, but they are not. him, John Oliver, and Stephen Colbert back in his old show, I would say not now, Jon Stewart, and Trevor Noah, they all function more than just comedians. And as much as they like to deny they are, and Jon Stewart denied it all the time, he's wrong. He is more than a comedian. They also are trying to impart knowledge and opinions to people and the news. So we'll talk about both of them. So you told me about, I think we even mentioned on the podcast, about this guy, Steve Rannazzisi.
Yeah, he's on a show called The League.
Yeah. Never watched that one, but I know about it.
It's like an all-star cast of killer funny people. I'll tell you that. If you find fantasy pools, sports fantasy pools amusing like I do, and you want to see great comedic actors, it's a show to be watched. He made up a thing completely about his whereabouts on 9/11. His whole thing was just he said he had to escape the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He worked at Merrill Lynch. He was in the South Tower when the plane struck the North Tower. He said which floor he was on. Their tower got jostled and they heard, Port Authority come on. It's very, very detailed. It's clearly somebody else's story. He scrambles downstairs. And then when he's on the ground, bam, second tower is hit. And it's a crazy, crazy story. And he stuck to that for many years. And then at one point, I don't know if somebody else exposed him, so he just came clean. I don't remember that. Or he just decided to say, his statement was that as a young man, I made a mistake. I deeply regret it. And for that, I make apologies that may still not be enough. And he talks about making up the whole story of where he was on 9/11. And the point of his apology to me, the most important point, the most pertinent part of this, he says at the end of his apology, it is to the victims of 9/11 and to the people that love them and the people that love me that I ask for forgiveness. And that's the part that sticks. You want to make up some stories, that's fine. But it's like, don't take away something that was particularly horrific, traumatic, and awful for people actually, and try to be part of it. And it reminds me of the show Dear Evan Hansen.
The play, the Broadway play.
The play, yeah. When I say the show, I'm the Broadway show, the Broadway play. I went to see it in Toronto and heard an interview with the two people who created it. And both of them went to different high schools. They were talking about, in both their high schools, they had at least one kid die in high school. And when that kid died, they both remarked about how so many students were like, oh my God, I miss them. They were like this, and they were always like this. And there's this concept of collective grief, this psychological concept that maybe we should do an episode on, where people just want to be part of that grieving thing. And so people who never even talked to the deceased were all of a sudden like, I remember when he did this. People who wouldn't even lower themselves to ever, honor that person's presence, whatever, the jocks, nerds, whatever divides. And all of a sudden it's like, I remember that, and you just want to be part of something. And that was attributed to Steve Rannazzisi. And I believe in this is just my thought, what do I know? But I feel like it certainly smells of that with Hasan Minhaj as well, a little bit. Like his 9/11 stories were quote unquote not cool enough. And when I say not cool enough, I mean not compelling enough to be story worthy. And so he had to be part of these other stories, which I don't like that. I will say that.
I'll give my example from the news in a second. It's about Brian Williams, but let's get to that in a second. I do want to follow what you just said, though, because you wrote a one-man play called Muslim Interrupted. You wrote a book, Is There Bacon in Heaven, which are stories from your life. And I remember, just as a corollary to that, I had a friend, he was a consultant. He worked all around the world. He had some amazing stories from when he worked in Africa. They were so funny and interesting. I'm like, you got to write a book. So he tried to write a book, and he's like, no, it's just a collection of anecdotes. There's no through line. So he felt he had to try and make up a romance in it, and that didn't happen. And he just in the end, I think he just gave up, because he's like, now I'm just making a fiction thing. It's barely based on anything that really happened. And we've seen this with many nonfiction writers in quotation marks, and they end up adding a bunch of things that turn out to be false later on. And so how did you address that? Or am I, breaking out a big bombshell here that you lied throughout your memoir.
Second expose of the week.
That's right.
Another guy with the name Hasan in his name. You know, there is I don't know what you would call it, not a mantra, but there is this saying, never let the truth stand in the way of a good story, right? This is like storytellers believe this. And look, I'm not better than anybody, and I'm not trying to say that. And I do have some conflations to make the punchline, different, but I don't believe in really taking a story completely that is not mine and making it my own. I don't feel good about that. When I was doing a lot of stand-up as opposed to these longer storytelling shows that I do, it always struck me about, people who talked about like, yeah, my 11-year-old. And then later I go, oh, they have an 11-year-old? And somebody would say, yeah, their 11-year-old is 21 years old now. I'd be, what? Because I would feel bad. I'm making fun of my 4-year-old son, and that joke is now a year old, and now he's about to turn 6. I would be like, oh man, it's funnier if he's 4. And therein lies the problem, right? You're looking for funny, and there's something funnier about when something is said by a 4-year-old, and those same words from a 6-year-old are no longer funny. And so what you do is you pretend they're 4, or you write a new joke. And writing a new joke is much more difficult than pretending they're 4. And I don't know Hasan Minhaj's life, but that dude has got to be busy as hell. You can imagine, especially, he's got a young family, but he's also got The Daily Show. He's got, watching, what's that? The Morning Show. There he is watching this. He is watching Apple commercial, whatever, or whatever product he was shilling. That guy's got a lot going on. There's just not the time to not only not, sit there and mine your life for like the actual things that happen. There's not actually things happening to you. You're just going to your job and you're working all day. You're having interactions with people. And most of your experiences are maybe talking to other people and getting stories from them. So he's in a weird position that way. And I heard this morning on another podcast on Commotion on CBC, some of the panel that was gathered together on Friday to talk about the same subject. They were talking about, he's also mined trauma, like he is mining trauma by the shovelful. So it's like, that's kind of the brand. One of the comedians was saying that's what people seem to like out of people of color as well.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's another element here. This comedian in Toronto, Cassie, was saying, I used to talk about like cute little things like airports and airplane food, and nobody cared at all. As soon as I started talking about what it's like to be an Asian woman dating a white man, all of a sudden there's like this great interest and stuff like that. And so you find like, oh, your culture has to come into it. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know where I'm going with this other than I sympathize with him a little bit, but there is a slightly gross feeling about a couple of things. I do feel a little bit misled, and I can remove color out of this particular thing that I'm feeling because of exactly the two people you mentioned. I thought to myself, what if John Oliver did this? Would I feel the same way? 100%, maybe even more, because I'm a big fan of John Oliver's and I like Hasan Minhaj. But I love John Oliver. Jon Stewart, the exact same thing. I'd have been like, come on, man. People come to you for actual, and I think they take that responsibility seriously. It certainly seems like it. And that's a big part of this. That he's not a goofy one, he's not Bert Kreischer running around shirtless on stage and telling stories about the Russian mob that may or may not be true. Who cares? Thanks for a great story, Bert. This is a guy. And that's why also there's another element here that I have to mention. When he was doing Homecoming King, which is a great special, very, very funny. And again, mind, for emotions and emotional truth and all that. He put that woman's face on screen, blurred it out, but he's so like sort of tech driven in his shows, right? He wants technology to be part of it. That's his generation, his younger generation who's all tech. And that isn't cool. Like you're really presenting it as if the story is real when you put her face up. Now he blurred the face. He put her face up with the other person and he didn't do a good job making her anonymous. She was tracked down. She was doxxed. She was like, people were abusive to her for what she did to Hasan. And she's like, I told him I wasn't going to prom weeks before. That didn't happen on the night of prom. He made up that part of the story. And so that, and how little he cares about that is also a concern. That's not good.
Yeah, it becomes difficult. And what you mentioned before about Jon Stewart and John Oliver, yeah, so I was going to talk about Brian Williams. So this is the problem. He's a news anchor. Trust is the thing with a news anchor, right? That's what we respect news anchors for, is being forthright, honest.
Yeah. When I watch Tucker Carlson, that's what I always wanted from him.
Yes.
It's just a trustworthy guy and everything is truth.
So he claimed that he was basically flying in a military helicopter and it had been forced down after being hit by an RPG. And eventually, like after he said that, and it wasn't just actually one telling of this, that's what he kind of finally came out with, but this occurred over years and years. You know, at first he said it was a helicopter that was ahead of us. And then it changed that it was his. And then, they were fired upon and, the bullets missed him by inches. And it kind of just evolved over time. And, the people who were, the soldiers were like, this didn't happen, basically. It's been well established this is not really what happened. It was actually a helicopter that was about 30 minutes ahead of them. And they did have to land because they didn't want to be shot at, with an RPG. But so he's suspended for 6 months, I think, without pay, and he was demoted, NBC. So it was quite a big deal. But the interesting thing about this is I think it's a very different situation here. Malcolm Gladwell has a great podcast, Revisionist History, if people haven't listened to it. And several seasons ago, he had a whole episode on this. And he said, this is actually how memory works. Over time, we conflate and we combine different memories and we shift times, locations, and misremember details. So, part of it is in the retelling, part of it is combining things. I think we could all agree there's a big difference between a helicopter that you couldn't even see getting hit by an RPG and your own helicopter doing it, but he was a bit more forgiving in this situation. But even though that is pretty irresponsible, I would think, for someone who is based in the truth, as a news anchor should be, I think actually Hasan Minhaj's situation is worse than this, than what Brian Williams did.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and because I've thought a lot about it, and almost worse than Steve Rannazzisi, because Steve Rannazzisi, that had nothing to do with his comedy. Like, he was an actor on a TV show. Like, it's almost like, why are you telling the story? It wasn't part of any comedy act, as far as I know, and I don't know that much about it. And I think he did offend people. He had to apologize to Pete Davidson. I think he apologized personally to him because Pete Davidson's father died in 9/11. So I think Hasan Minhaj is worse. And this is the reason why. Like, first of all, he routinely challenges people. He interviewed Obama earlier on this year, I believe, and he asked Obama, he said he was talking about his best of list, best movies of the year, TV shows, music, right, albums. He said, you don't really consume all that, do you? And Obama said, no, I do. And Minhaj pushed back and said, no, you didn't. No, you don't. I'm like, you're doing it as a joke, but you're kind of serious about it. You do think that he hires a bunch of people and they all say, you should make sure you mention, the last season of Atlanta, make sure you mention this book, right? And it's just so interesting that he's calling out the president on this when he has this whole lie.
When I spoke to him, I interviewed Hasan Minhaj. He pushed back on me as well. And I was the president of my high school debating club. That's not true. I just made that up. There was no debating club in my high school. But yes, no, pushback is what he does. I mean, is what I mean to say.
And I remember, because we've talked about this on the podcast before, he was like, why don't you pronounce your name Ali Hassan? Yeah. And then you're like, well, it doesn't matter. He's like, no, it does matter. It does matter.
You know it matters, dude. You know it matters. And I was like,
it matters to you, but does it? This is the problem. This is the exact problem with him. So he pushes back on these people. And I actually last night watched The King's Jester. I always meant to watch it, just never got around to it. It came out last year and I just never got around to it. But watching something after the fact is like, so some of the jokes are hilarious. He does a whole thing about Kumail Nanjiani's like topless, shirtless photo of him all buff and how that makes other brown guys look bad. It's great. There's some really funny stuff. He talks about picture day at school, which is also a great little bit. So really funny stuff. And,
But you never found yourself during those bits wondering, is this even true?
No, good point. So Of course they're not true. Him talking about how he was confronting some hedge fund manager at the school when his daughter had like a big runny nose and it was all gross, and he confronts this guy. Like, of course that's not true. I mean, I realize that because it's played for laughs, right? He has another one about his daughter just staring at him in the eyes, and of course that's how you know she's Indian, because she stares all the time, because Indian people stare at you all the time, in case you non-Indians didn't know that. So, of course, I'm sure his daughter does stare. So there are things that I know are just, but that's part of the humor, right? But this is the key. So I wrote this down when I was watching it. It's towards the end of the special, he's like, talking to the audience. Everything here is built on trust. I need to be able to switch between satire and sincerity and trust that you know the difference. He said this in his special. This is the problem. This is, you've encapsulated the problem with you, Hasan. The problem is that he's not mining these stories for laughs. If he was, it's perfect. It doesn't matter. Like if these stories were all about the jokes, but they're not. He talks about, seeing this brother Eric, and they ran to the bathroom and he got arrested by the cop and all this stuff that happens, and he tried to get him to confess, and none of this happened. And when he says it, you hear people in the audience gasp and go, oh, and like they're so emotionally invested in this story. And his daughter, the anthrax, and the doctor comes out, with an FBI agent behind them saying, you've really angered some people if they're doing this to you. The audience is like, their breath is held. They're so into it. And it's like, what are you doing here? Because people know you're making up the stuff for the comedy, but they don't know that you're making this stuff up. Again, his last special, I loved it, The Homecoming King, because it balanced the sympathy for his situation and the comedy. But I'm like, if the sympathy is all manufactured, I don't know.
Well, he's asked in this New Yorker article, do you feel like you're manipulating people? And he says, I'm not, and I don't feel that, because the idea is to get to an emotional truth. And this is some people will call it, his guiding light, and some people will call it maybe a crutch, or, some kind of like this sort of phony thing that he relies on. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, those are interesting things you're saying about it being worse than Brian Williams. I can't help but wonder how many audience members will really care. This is a huge problem in comedy. They're not going to not book him. This guy has 2 million followers on Instagram. At most, I feel like it'll go down to 1.7. You know what I mean? He's not being abandoned. People in general are not going to care. His friends in comedy are still his friends. People who love him are still going to love him. People still loved Bill Cosby till like this morning. You know what I mean? Like always. It's just, and this is part of the problem. Like in this industry, no matter what, you're stealing jokes, and there's like these people going, he stole that joke from me. I wrote that joke. We were like, oh, that sucks. Anyway, I got tickets for him, $100 a ticket. I'm going to go see him in November. They don't really care. Will audience members, because audience members, there's that cognitive dissonance. It's like, well, I didn't go to the show expecting the comedian to tell the truth. That's not what I go to comedy for, right? That's the first thing. And then, I can't help but people think that people are also going to feel like, this dude's pretty smug, right? Mm-hmm. He's a pretty smug,
he is. Yes.
Cocky dude. You just illustrated it in the way he pushes back at the former president, right? This is where he's good. And I think some people are going to see like, oh, they saw a successful brown man making it, and this is like revenge because he had too much power, and they wanted to bring him down a few notches. So the counterbalance for those people will be like, so I'm going to support Hasan even more. So
there will be people like that. I think it's going to be a bit more tricky because let's use Louis C.K. as an example. You and I don't listen to Louis C.K. anymore. I think he never apologized for the disgusting things he did. And
that's the reason I don't listen. Had he apologized, it would have been a different thing.
Other people, Michelle Wolf disagrees. She just came out the other day saying that, she thinks he's apologized enough. And well, that's your opinion, Michelle. I disagree with it. But those people, his Louis C.K.'s fans can say, I'm separating the art from the artist. The problem is his art, it's all intertwined because it's his sincerity that people are attracted to. That's the reason why you like something like Homecoming King more than, say, the typical stand-up special, because it weaves in the sympathy, which I don't think he has anymore. I don't think I can watch anymore. I could watch a straight comedy show from him. I couldn't fathom trying to watch something where he's being sincere, telling a sincere story. And so this is why I don't think he's going to be on The Daily Show. And this is the number one thing which I was going to finish with is I'll tell you why he can never be on The Daily Show or have Patriot Act again. Because this is a type of expose that he would do on somebody else in a heartbeat. That's it. He's been got by the exact thing he used to do to other people.
He got. Yeah, you might be right. I don't believe he's going to be canceled. I don't believe it's the last we've heard of Hasan Minhaj. I think he will always have his fans, people who grew up with him and they helped him see themselves, right? They felt represented and seen because of him. He'll always have that. But I believe you've got a great point that the Daily Show producers will absolutely have to keep in mind. Homie got. Okay, Asif, narcissistic personality disorder, which we will refer to as NPD for short. Again, unrelated to our discussion, probably, maybe. We don't know, but just something we've wanted to talk about for a while. Something that I happen to, again, I don't know what this says about me, but, when we talked about BPD, which is borderline personality disorder, I did have some knowledge about that. I also have some knowledge about NPD. Mm-hmm. Somebody, let's say someone in the extended family definitely has it. It's quite clear. I'll reference them throughout this segment. And also, I'm a comedian, and I'm pretty sure, I know a few comedians who suffer from this. Suffer is an interesting word because some of them don't fully realize they're suffering at all. And then, there's a few other people I've met along the way in my life, friends.
I definitely know some of your friends who are like this, and I'm sure you could think of some examples from my friends. And of course, lots of my colleagues do have this, God complex and doctors. It's all intertwined, right?
Okay, so that's interesting that God complex and NPD come up in the same sentence. So let's talk about it. What is narcissistic personality disorder?
Yeah, so in general, it's this pattern of behavior. So it's a personality disorder. It's something that can be ingrained in people from an early age. We'll talk about the reasons why. The main things is a sense of grandiosity, a need for constant admiration, and a lack of empathy. So now you're starting to see some of these things, why, even though Ali and I do very different things for a living, right? That some of these people are attracted to these different fields that we do, even though they're quite opposite, right?
Yeah.
The term narcissist or narcissistic personality is based on the legend of Narcissus from Greek mythology. Good old Narcissus. So the story goes that there was this mountain nymph named Echo, and Echo saw Narcissus, this beautiful young man who rejected her. So she lived out her life in desolation and kind of faded away until only an echo of her voice remained. Now, then there was Nemesis. We use the term Nemesis all the time, but that was the god of revenge. He punished Narcissus by luring him to a pool of water. And I think people have heard about this. He looked at his image. He didn't realize it was his own reflection. And he's like, oh, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And he falls in love with his image. And the more he stares, the more infatuated he becomes. And then he realizes that his love can never be reciprocated because it's just an image. And so he just remains in despair, fixated by his image. And then he just dies. So he has the same fate that he inflicted on Echo happens to him. And Echo is at his side, this disembodiment who just repeats his last words over and over again. So the sad story of Narcissus and Echo.
Nemesis is pretty mean in that story.
Yeah, he was a bit of the goddess of revenge. I may have said god of revenge. I apologize. Nemesis is a goddess. So Nemesis, but that's Nemesis's job, right? Anyway, so that's basically the story and where it kind of comes from.
So that is more a story about Greek mythology and the word narcissist. But when I say, what is it? What I'm really looking for is those DSM criteria of what makes a narcissist, because that's to me, that was one of the most enlightening things. We went, as we were thinking, does this family member have NPD? We pulled up this list of criteria. You have NPD if you have 10 of these 12 things. And it was just like ding, 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 ding. And, he won the narcissism game in that moment. There was maybe one thing he didn't have.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and DSM, I think we've talked about it many times. For those who may not know, those who are more entertainment inclined and not medically inclined, it's the diagnostic systems manual
and statistical manual. You always get that wrong, but that's okay.
And it's a book. It's a big. It has the
it's
stuff.
A book that we use. Okay, so there are actually two subtypes of NPD: the grandiose subtype and the vulnerable subtype. So the grandiose one, that's the kind of the more classic one. You look arrogant, pretentious, dominant, self-assured, maybe aggressive, and the latter one, you're overly sensitive and insecure and defensive about everything and maybe anxious. And there's a big, heavy undercurrent of shame and anxiety. So it's interesting because they're almost opposite presentations.
Yeah.
This guy Rosenfeld kind of initially described these as being thick-skinned or thin-skinned narcissism. So you can kind of think of it like that. But both people do the same thing. They have a preoccupation with satisfying their own needs at the expense or consideration of others. Okay? So now we're getting to be like, oh, wait a minute, this sounds like somebody I know. So here's the criteria. You need this pervasive pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and this lack of empathy begins in early adulthood. And you need 5 of these criteria, okay? Number 1 has a grandiose sense of self-importance. So you exaggerate your achievements. You want to be recognized as superior to others. Even if you haven't done these things, you kind of make it up and want to be superior. Preoccupied with fantasies of success, power, brilliance, beauty, perfect love. You believe that you are special and you can only associate with other people who are special or institutions that are special, right? I need to go to the best medical school. I'm the best. You need admiration all the time. There's a sense of entitlement, such as an unreasonable expectation of favorable treatment, or that you are going to comply with their expectations. So you being the victim of the narcissist, right? Like you have to comply with whatever they want. Exploitative and takes advantage of others to their own ends. Lacks empathy, cannot identify with the needs of others. Is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of them. And then shows arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. So those are the criteria. You need 5 of those. So,
and haughty, by the way, is not another way of saying hot behaviors.
Yeah, I may have mispronounced
sexy.
that. Haughty. Yeah. So those are the criteria.
So tell me, how common is it? And also, is it something that's increasing in society? Is it something that's, especially when you say entitlement, you just feel like more and more people have these feelings of entitlement in society. Is this
I'll get to that
narcissism?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
So it's very difficult to diagnose it. So the prevalence estimates are very difficult to kind of ascertain. They think that it could be as little as 0.5% of just people out there in the community to as high as 15%, in clinical settings. So like in a psychiatrist's office or psychiatrist practice, 15% of their patients maybe will have NPD, whereas in the overall community, maybe 0.5 to 1%. So it's still pretty common, but it is difficult to get a handle on things. But what you mentioned before is interesting. There is accumulated evidence, okay, that there's rising rates of narcissism in American college students if they look at a period of time between 1979 and 2006. And some people say this is an epidemic of narcissism in American society. The idea from these cultural psychologists and anthropologists, they basically think that the USA is very focused on individualism and professional success and fame and wealth. You celebrate all these things, whereas Eastern cultures and Asia and the Middle East, they kind of have a shared idea of shared parenting, collectivism, and they have less of these traits. So Western countries such as the USA are higher than these other countries.
So you're saying that it's on the increase with college students in America, let's just say North America and Western countries in general, I'm sure, but what causes it?
Yes, again, we don't really know, but there is felt to perhaps be a genetic predisposition. But again, the nature-nurture argument becomes very difficult to kind of tease those things out. We know that people who have NPD have aggression, reduced tolerance to distress, and a dysfunctional, ability to regulate their moods. But one of the thoughts is that developmental experiences, like as a child being rejected, may contribute to this occurrence of NPD. And they think as well, maybe if you got excessive praise as a child and you were like the golden child and you could do no wrong, that also may lead to it. It probably is a bit more of maybe the failure of the parents to empathize with their child. And then you have to develop this. So you could think about this insecurity is so deep down, you have to develop this grandiose omnipotence attitude in order to kind of make up for that. So you have to kind of retreat into yourself and feel special because you didn't get that feeling of specialness from your parents, right?
Yeah.
These people have a capacity for guilt or mourning or sadness that's really lacking. And this results in these feelings of shame, which you overcompensate for, and then envy and aggression. So it's really more from like a developmental psychology point of view. It's been examined.
The main person I think about, in our extended family there, this is a person who's screwed up many things, lost his wife and children, and, can't hold down a job, alcoholic, but somehow it's never their fault.
Mm-hmm.
If there was a moment of like, man, what have I done? There might be some like room for some kind of change or improvement, but you can't really sort of crack that. They went for rehab for alcohol. They went for treatment and they bailed early. Rehab is stupid. They don't know what they're doing, of course, was the comment there. But also we had access to the report, and that report was also very illustrative that this person takes no responsibility for their own actions and jokes around a lot about serious things because they can't take things seriously, because then that would, it felt like it's protective because the further you go into serious, you might finally like come to terms with, oh my God, I screwed things up.
Well, I should say substance abuse is very common with these people, but it's so interesting you mentioned that because the reason they seek treatment, it might be for the substance abuse, but they often seek treatment not because they're like, I need to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. Often it's like their relationships, their lives don't live up to their standards and expectations. Mm-hmm. So they may see something like, how can I deal? They see a psychiatrist or psychologist. How can I deal with all these people who don't understand me? Or, and then because, it's everybody else's problem but their own, right? As you were saying. So they externalize and project onto others victimhood, blaming others, criticizing other people for faults in other people, but don't see them in themselves. Like, again, it's everything you just said, right? And so, you could be fired because you're a difficult person to work with. And then you're like, well, why am I being fired? And then you might be going to mental health because of that, like, are you trying to deal with all these people who don't understand me? They're out to get me. Or they can develop depression, suicidality, social isolation, as you said. So it's all, and these emptiness and dysphoria and despair. And really they have these feelings of worthlessness, right? Deep down. But as you said, that's, the very, very deep down, which you probably can't even get to, is this superficial.
But just to be clear, the worthlessness is very deep down and it's at odds with often their incredible sense of self-worth, which they've been fed as a young person, right? It's this discrepancy, this thing that
exactly. They will probably never admit to that. Maybe they will eventually with treatment, but
it's pretty clear that people aren't going to go check themselves in, right? They're not going to say, I think I have NPD, I need help. That's not what this condition, permits people to do. So it's probably other people, if not medical professionals, some people like the partners, spouses, that kind of stuff, who are probably concerned. So how does it get diagnosed in the end?
Yeah, usually it's just a standard psychiatric interview. These things will come out and the psychiatrist will kind of, focus in on some of these areas. There are instruments that you can use, like questionnaires, et cetera, that a psychiatrist or a psychologist can go through with you to go through these to kind of diagnose that. An interesting problem that occurs, which is almost diagnostic of this, is something called countertransference. Have you ever heard of this before?
I know this term. Yeah. I cannot remember what that is. I don't know.
It is a bit more complicated. I'm going to try and simplify it, so I apologize to my colleagues in psychiatry and psychology for simplifying this. So let's start with the problem in someone with NPD. They have these feelings of shame and humiliation, and they feel that there's a lack of respect from others. People are slighting them all the time. Okay, so if you offer therapeutic help as a psychologist or psychiatrist, that may precipitate feelings of shame in the individual because now they're vulnerable because they are a patient. These feelings then may be difficult for the person with NPD to tolerate. So then they project even more of this grandiosity and omnipotence, and they almost want to make the physician or psychologist feel shameful and inadequate.
Wow.
Right? And then the countertransference is when you realize that you're developing these feelings of frustration, anger, this is never going to work, this therapeutic relationship is not there. Sometimes they'll do the opposite, where the narcissist will inflate the ego of the, you're the best doctor I've ever had, whatever. And some of this also occurs with people with borderline personality disorder, which we talked about in a previous episode. Feel free to check that out in the archives. So it's almost like the psychiatrist or psychologist needs to be aware of this countertransference, but it's almost like once you start feeling those feelings, you're like, wait a minute, this person is probably has NPD because they're trying to engender these feelings in me, or I'm feeling these things. It's not a purposeful thing. It just what ends up happening. So anyway, it's an interesting kind of like finding that has been pointed out in some articles that I read about it. But in the end, you treat these patients with standard psychological therapy. There's different strategies, different modalities based on different types of psychology. None of them have been really rigorously tested. So it's hard to recommend one versus the other. Again, the psychologists kind of know the different strategies that they can use. And there's no medicine either that necessarily helps. So it can be difficult to treat, and it's definitely a long road for the therapist and for the patient.
So no proven treatment. NPD is not easily solved by any means. And then you have to look at sort of techniques and tactics and strategies, right? For the people dealing with NPD. Yeah. So what are those? How do you get into that?
It's very difficult. And so what I think the advice that they give to a physician dealing with someone with NPD is to, couple tips. Anticipate being treated as an audience to the patient's performance. Okay, very interesting. And
very
again, why are these?
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Expect to be drawn into lengthy accounts of the patient's life. It's that main character syndrome, right? Everything is about them. When you interview them, you should agree at the start how and why you will interrupt them. Okay, so an experienced psychiatrist or psychologist knows this. Anticipate negative responses to perceived criticism, okay? Because anything that they perceive as disrespectful will create shame or humiliation in them, and they will react accordingly.
Defensively, probably.
Avoid directly challenging them, right? Try and get around some of these ways, instead of directly challenging them. Be empathetic with them without colluding to like their sense of grandiosity, right? But listening, empathetic listening. And you should reflect in yourself about this countertransference rather than revealing these to the patient. You don't want to tell them you're infuriating me right now. Like that is probably not going to work.
These are awful strategies. Let me just be frank with you. This is helping nobody.
This
is just baseline managing your own mental health when dealing with somebody.
Listen,
who has
man,
NPD.
This is why the therapists who know how to deal with this, I mean, my hat is off to them. They are very, very skilled. It's a very difficult disorder to try and treat. Even just starting off and thinking about an approach is very difficult. They really are impressive, the people who deal with this all the time.
When it goes untreated, which it seems like that's people's lives, it's a whole life of no treatment. What are other complications that can stem from NPD?
I mean, it's mainly the other things we talked about. So you could have mood disorders, substance use, as we talked about, having other personality disorders. But, NPD is associated with a higher risk of death by suicide as compared to other personality disorders. So not attempted suicide, but death or like completed suicide, as we say, right? So probably...
Which is interesting also because you think, with my apologies to anybody who's suffering through this, tangentially or directly, but you would think somebody who believes that they're God's gift to this green earth would not then end their life, right? Not on paper anyway. So things have to get pretty bad where they just, they're in despair over the fact that why are the best things that I deserve not happening.
Right, exactly.
I would be remiss, Asif, not to end this discussion by not talking about the one person that I think probably every listener is thinking about. He's out there in the world. We've come to know him in the last, half a decade, and it's hard not to think about him. And much has been mentioned, the word narcissism comes up with him. But what are the thoughts on Donald Trump? Because I've been wanting to bring up his name the entire time, but I thought, let's get all the information out to see if there's anything that makes me go, oh, so then not Donald Trump, but that hasn't happened.
Well, okay. It's tough because I guess what happened towards the end of his presidency and even the middle of it, psychiatrists, some very famous ones, came out and said that he has narcissistic personality disorder. This led the American Psychiatric Association to issue a warning to its members to basically say, stop psychoanalyzing the president. Not because whether he does or doesn't, but you as an individual person who has never met the person in question, Donald Trump, or certainly not conducted a psychiatric evaluation of him, you really don't know. And you are simplifying a complex diagnosis, right? And I think that is the issue. But on the other hand, I
am not a member of the American Psychiatric Association, so I don't have to heed that warning at all. I just know this checklist.
Whenever I see patients, I so rarely tell them, it's 100% this or it's 100% not this. Often I will say it's 100% not something because it's reassuring. You 100% do not have a brain tumor, like that, because it's reassuring. But if a balance of probabilities, I'm like, it is quite likely that he has narcissistic personality disorder. That's how I would phrase it. I think it is quite likely on balance of probabilities that he does.
I would have said textbook, but what do I know, huh? I'm not one of you doctory people. What do I know? But yeah, I think what do I know is where we ended.
Okay, guys, that is our episode for today. As you could tell, Ali and I really want to talk about both of these topics. They were very, very interesting for us, hot off the presses. So let us know what you guys thought about the episode, drvcomedian@gmail.com, Dr. V Comedian on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We are everywhere. Reach out to us. Let us know what you guys thought. Any other topics? There are lots of other personality disorders, Ali, that we can talk about, for better or for worse. We could talk about that. Very curious what you guys think about Hasan Minhaj's controversy and that article in the New Yorker, and very curious to see what happens going forward with him. Ali, anything for October going on?
In Toronto, there's a show called Accent on Toronto. It is sold out, so I can't even promote it, but that will be great. You can listen to Laugh Out Loud on CBC Radio, and you will hear clips from Accent on Toronto over the course of the next few months. Besides that, filming season 3 of Run the Burbs and other stuff here and there. Might be in Kelowna. I don't know if I'll be able to make it, but on October 27th, at the end of October, Laugh Out Loud will be in Kelowna. So if you're in the region, in the interior of BC, and you want a good time, we canceled this in August because of obvious reasons, forest fires and this kind of stuff that was happening in the region.
You rescheduled.
But it has been rescheduled to the end of October, and it will be an excellent show.
Around that same time, I will be seeing U2 in Las Vegas with my wife and some friends. So I will not be in Kelowna, but I will report back to you guys about this concert.
So if you want a diagnosis of some kind and you can get to the concert, Asif will hand those out free.
That's
in
right.
the bathroom on level 3. Or are you not everyone's doctor, Asif?
Well, that's right, Ali. Remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor or Donald Trump's doctor or Bono's doctor when I see him in... maybe I'll diagnose him with MPD. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening.
Bye.